Welcome to the IT Woodworker Podcast, where we discuss business and IT topics. I also include a woodworking project every once in a while, which is something that helps me keep my sanity in this fast-paced business we work in. If you enjoy the podcast, please like it, subscribe to it, and share it with your friends and colleagues. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to another episode of the IT Woodworker. I'm Chris Kousoulas, joined with my co-host Katie McCullough. Katie, welcome. It's always great to see your smiling face. How you been?
Very good. And Chris, good to see you back. And you didn't just stay on those beaches in Mexico.
It was very tempting. I got this weird thing called a mortgage, so I don't know. They said I had to come back, so here I am.
Lucky you to be back in the cold and freezing, right?
Yeah, lucky. I'm not sure that's the word I would use, but lucky me. Yeah, thanks for recognizing that.
Uh-huh.
So, all right, as we get into this next episode here, Katie, I believe we're going to talk a little bit about compliance versus security, and what the reality is and the meaning are of the both of them. So, since you're the expert and I'm not, why don't you just go ahead and jump right in here and let's get started.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, this feeds into so many of the topics we've been talking about, Chris. I'll even back it up. We've talked about control frameworks, Center for Internet Security being a big one. They call out that companies are going to depend on various service providers, right? OneNeck, they're a service provider. They provide discrete and critical services for customers. So does Panzura. And so security controls recognize you're going to have to interact with third parties. And so they want to establish some controls around how you do that. And so they have a whole series of safeguards, right, that you can go through individually and look at it for your own business and how, you manage that service provider network in terms of, do you just know all of them that you have? Right. Looking back at some of the big events we've had with SolarWinds and Log4j, right? So many companies had to go back and look at how they interacted with companies to see, did they use that product or service? And so it makes you a lot more efficient in those moments when something bad has been determined to understand what dependencies you have in your environment. So there's all sorts of goodness in understanding your service provider network and the controls you have around to manage them. So that's kind of one leading piece into this. But the other piece, before we dive too deep just into compliance, and I'll get to why compliance feeds into that service provider management, but the other big piece to talk about when you're talking about compliance is compliance does not equal security. Security can absolutely be a foundation to compliance, but just because you have a third party, even accredited report from somebody, there are very few auditors that dive as deep as would need to be to really understand how your security control set goes across your full environment and everything you do. So it is always important to start fundamentally and foundationally with strong security controls, again, using the frameworks that we've talked about, but extending that into things like your IT processes, leveraging an ITIL framework. Whereas our security frameworks, there's a lot of different ones out there. Most people under an IT process, they look at ITIL as being a key component. And that is outside of technically security, but having those types of process controls and service management controls not only will help your compliance, but do feed into security as well. And then the third piece to that, for certainly somebody like Panzura, are your software development controls, right? Having a CI/CD pipeline so that you're scanning all your code for OWASP best practices or any dependent libraries that you have that may have vulnerabilities, right? All those three foundational pieces, that's about how you run your business first and foremost. And if you have all those elements in place, I guarantee you getting compliance, third-party accredited third-party attestations and certifications are going to be a heck of a lot easier than just trying to go the reverse. Oh, just give me what you're going to audit me on, and then I'll figure it out. It's going to be a mess for you, right?
Okay.
So, right, I've been in the service provider industry pretty much all my life. So having things like compliance, definitely for service providers, but you see more and more even businesses where they want to prove to their own internal business units that they do what they say they do. And so you still leverage a compliance and a third party accredited firm to come in and help you review your controls and understand the consistency you have in operating those controls. So it's important. I mean, compliance can be used definitely for service providers, but also, again, when you're an internal business unit, especially in IT, and you want to prove out you do what you say you do to the rest of the business units. So let me take a step back then and talk about where I started with this whole service provider management control set that is in the CIS, and you'll see that in any security framework, right?
Mm-hmm.
The by going through a compliance effort, you actually can minimize the effort then a customer or somebody else has to invest in making sure their service provider management controls are properly working, right? Because
And when you say go through a compliance effort, you're saying as a service provider going through that compliance effort, right? Is that what you're saying?
Spot on.
Okay.
That's the most likely use case. I mean, there's some others that we could talk about, but yeah. So I'm sure you've had this experience, right? One of your customers will say, "Hey, Chris, I need you to fill out this security questionnaire."
Yep.
You familiar with those, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And that's part of their service provider program, right? So all these companies, right, this has become a huge thing because of all the vulnerabilities and risks that other entities bring into your business. You have to go through your due diligence, right? So
that compliance document is just we're adhering to specific regulations. When we fill that out, we're saying. So I think I'm starting to understand the difference here. We're just saying we do comply. Yep, we do hit all we cross all these T's and dot all these I's, and that's how it's really different from the security. Is it really doesn't. It says you're doing it, but doesn't really add that security value. Is that where we're going?
Well, there's two pieces to it. The point you're making is huge, right? So if you just fill out one of those security questionnaires, that that company that's asking you to do that is completely dependent on the transparency and validity of your answers.
Sure.
And not that people are trying to to actually deceive people, but they're just going off the top of their head saying, yeah, we've got some things in place that would help with that, right? They don't have anybody looking at that and asking for evidence. Now, a lot of those questionnaires will ask, right? Can you provide your policies? Can you provide a test result? Well, a lot of those things you're not going to be able to provide because that's business confidential.
Yeah.
And it's still putting that burden on your customers to have to then evaluate all that information. I mean, that's a big burden. So the position has to be, especially for service providers, if you go through a third party to attest to all the controls, and I guarantee you 80 to 90% of them are exactly what you see on those security questionnaires, and you take that burden off the customer. Now, and when you use a third party, they're going to be accredited, right? So they have to use a standard methodology in how they assess you. So it can't just be, oh, I'm going to assess you on, doing it this way. Grant Thornton, Shillman, Price Waterhouse, right? All of them have standard regulations and methodologies in the same, whether you're one audit firm or another. That you have the same guidelines, right? So it starts to give you real assurances that at least some third party has dug into these things.
Mhm.
Now, back to your other state. So that's one element. Yes, if you're filling out a security questionnaire and you're just giving your raw answers, there could be some gray areas, shall we say, in those answers.
Yeah.
So the preferred way to do that is leveraging a third-party accredited firm that's going to do more due diligence. And as a service provider, you're going to have a non-disclosure agreement in place so you can expose a lot more of the data, like your pen testing, your vulnerability scans, right? They're going to get a much bigger picture. But to take that even a step further to what you were talking about earlier, even if you can pass that with your auditors, it still doesn't mean you've got all the security controls that you should have, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're still just providing either a scope based on a specific service, and the auditors aren't going to look through every config, right? They're going to go through they're going to take a population of devices to look at how they authenticate, right? I take that back. They're going to ask for a population of devices that are in your environment. And then they're going to take a sample set. So in a sample set is probably like under 10% of the number of devices you have. And so you could definitely have some gaps in your security if you don't, that aren't visible through that audit. So believe me, any security leader you talk to and any security teams you talk to at your customers, and if you just brush them off and say, oh no, we got all these compliances, I guarantee you're not going to be talking to them very long because they're going to say,
business.
Yeah, we're done here. So, it's important to understand there is a distinction between security and compliance. That being said, especially for service providers, there are so many different accreditations and certifications you can get out there. It's overwhelming, right? And so, for my role, it's always been working with the customers to understand what's most relevant for them. One of the great reference points I always use is Microsoft's certification site, because as you can imagine with Microsoft, right, they have all these different services that they want to provide globally. And when you start looking at global compliance, different industries, even regional, I mean, they've got, it must be, I'm looking at it now, over 100 different control sets, frameworks, whatever you want to call it, that they attest to, so that they can get different business areas. Most service providers can't do that. It's too expensive, right? So that's where I say it's just really important to understand your customer set, what's relevant to them. If you're going to be in the service provider industry, like folks like OneNeck or Panzura, table stakes to that are things like your SOC 1 or SOC 2. SOC 2 more and more these days. But if you handle a lot of credit card data, guess what? You better have a PCI certification. If you're doing a lot of business with federal and government agencies, there's been an evolution of different compliance frameworks. It definitely at its core starts with NIST 853, but there's all sorts of, I guess, offshoots, I'd call them, or evolutions. Currently, the big one being pushed at the federal level is what they call CMMC, which stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So, and it's an evolving thing, right? Because the threat landscape evolves, adversaries evolve, right? So it's not, hey, I'm going to get this compliance. One, you have to reattest to most of them on a yearly basis. And there's always going to be evolutions and changes to those too. So it's not something that's easy. But as a customer, you should be asking that of your service providers. You should have a service provider management program as defined by a framework, again, CIS being a great one. But then service providers, in order to take the burden off of their customers as much as possible, need to look to these third-party accredited firms to help give them the accreditations and certifications that are most relevant to their customers.
It takes the burden off of our customers. It also takes the burden off of ourselves, because it's not always going to be the same person who's going to be filling that out. And there is some risk to the people, to an organization if they're filling that out. I mean, if they're going to attest to it, then they're putting their self on the table saying, yeah, we really did do this. And you want to do that. And to your point, we're not trying to be deceptive of anything. If we don't have it done properly, then it's not, we don't have it accurate. So, and I think as a company looking at vendors, they want to make sure that they have third-party attestations, correct, when they're working with them. And it gets you through the process so much quicker. And you don't want to say, yeah, we had that done 5 years ago. So that's bad.
Well, to your point, it just removes a lot of barriers in those conversations with customers. So and some of them just have a hard stop on it. They'll say, we're not even talking to you unless you have this. But, if it's a service they're really looking for, they might negotiate with you a little bit, but it just takes that off the table. God, I lost my train of thought because I had a good point, but I completely forgot it now. I know what it is. For companies, it helps with your evaluation from an investor and industry standpoint in how they look at the value of your company, right? So I mean, there's real financial benefits beyond just being able to get customers that can play into, because then you've proven out to a certain level that you understand the importance of things like security, ITIL processes, DevOps frameworks, right? All those things that go into providing a service. And so it's definitely something that ends up falling to the security team. It is not, I would say, when you join a security team, you want to join it because you want to dig into incidents and you want to manage security tools that's bringing all this telemetry. But because of the nature of compliance, that can end up in the security team. And especially when you're smaller teams, you end up having to wear a lot of different hats. But it's an important part of the business, especially, again, in that service provider business. But like I said, individual businesses are starting to want to do it for themselves to prove out to the rest of the business units that they do what they say they do.
Mm-hmm. So it's a real asset to have it done. So, well, excellent. You've again educated me well, so I appreciate that. Should we cut away for just a bit here and then come back and wrap up?
Perfect.
All right, welcome back. And Katie, why don't you take us home here with this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris, as we talked about where we started, and to me, this is an important part because it comes back to these critical frameworks that people are out there globally providing research and data about what's most important to have in a security control system. And as CIS has identified, in any framework you're going to find out there, having a service provider management program for your own company is critical because you've got so many dependencies, whether it's, somebody like OneNeck, where they're providing infrastructure through Rely Cloud, or somebody like Panzura, where we're providing global data management systems. You're going to want to use these services because it makes your company better, but you need to understand the security they provide around those platforms that are then housing your critical data or services, right? Sure. So I highly encourage folks to check out the service provider safeguards in the CIS, but then also, from that, typically customers are going to create these security questionnaires, and there's all sorts of help out there. There's different, just templates that you can leverage. But the reality is you're going to get overwhelmed pretty quick with all the information that it says you should gather. And so that's where, you really, if it's a service provider you want to do business with, talk to them about the accreditations, the certifications that they're getting so that you don't have to do all that work on yourself because it's going to be a huge burden on you. And as a service provider, you better be prepared for those conversations and making that, quite frankly, sales cycle simpler for folks like you, Chris.
Yeah. And hey, that's what this is all about, Katie. Thanks for that. So thank you.
No, but I mean, to be fair, right, at the end of the day, a customer needs a service or a function like something like OneNeck or Panzer is providing, and they don't want to mess around with all the
No.
details. They just want to talk about the function and the business outcome
Yeah.
that your service is going to be able to provide. So, I mean, it's to everybody's benefit, right?
Those third-party validations should be table stakes, so you can move to the next phase and get to the brass tacks. So excellent.
Exactly.
Well, good. Well, Katie, as always, it's a pleasure. So
please bring your dog back more. He's much more handsome than you are.
yeah, for sure. All right, Katie. Thanks. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Chris. You too.